Hall and Wilcox acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands on which this podcast is recorded. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and to all First Nations people joining us today.
Hello, and welcome to the second episode in our series looking at the latest developments in health practitioner regulation across Australia. I'm Bridget Wall. I'm a partner at Hall and Wilcox. I act for healthcare practitioners in relation to defending civil claims and disciplinary claims. Today, we are going to be discussing the area of medicinal cannabis. I am joined today by two of my fellow partners at Hall and Wilcox who have specific expertise in this area. Welcome, Mitch Stein.
Thanks, Bridget.
And we are also very lucky to be joined today by our fellow partner, Alison Choi Flanagan. Welcome, Alison.
Thanks, Bridget.
Alison, can you please tell us a bit about yourself and your practice?
Thanks, Bridget. So my name's Alison Choi Flanagan and I'm a partner with Hall and Wilcox. We're a national law firm and I co-lead the health and care practice at Hall and Wilcox, and that includes acting for health, aged care, disability and life sciences, which includes medicines and medical devices.
Great. So the topic for today is medicinal cannabis. Alison, what have been your observations over the past 12 months in the regulatory environment for medicinal cannabis?
Well, Bridget, it's been a really interesting last 12 months. So much has been happening in the area of medicinal cannabis. Medicinal cannabis is booming in Australia and with more than 1 million prescriptions issued for the drug since it was legalised in 2016. And according to some sources, the medicinal cannabis is treating at least 2.7% of the population. And an estimate back in 2022, an estimated 600,000 Australians are using medicinal cannabis. What they're using it is mainly for chronic pain. And so some of the work that we've been doing at Hall and Wilcox includes the sort of work that I've been doing on the front end, and that includes acting for companies that want to supply medicinal cannabis. So we advise them on the licensing and authorisation requirements. We've also been we advised on one of the first clinical trials for medicinal cannabis, which involved public hospitals in Australia. That was many years ago now.
Wow.
And we've also been advising clients in relation to setting up medicinal cannabis companies, advising on promotion of medicinal cannabis, and then the team, including Mitchell and you, include the back end, which is advising medical practitioners in relation to issues such as dosage and also investigations, including disciplinary investigations, including medicinal cannabis. So collectively across all the tables, we've been working quite a lot in the area, and it is a highly regulated area of law, and it's really important that people who want to work in this area, whether they're a supplier of medicinal cannabis or they're a medical practitioner wanting to prescribe it or a pharmacy wanting to dispense it, to really be up to date with what the legal requirements are, because obviously cannabis itself is a restricted drug, and so the penalties for breaching the relevant laws can be very high. Some of the things that we've been seeing, the observations I've been seeing in the past 12 months in the regulatory environment, particularly includes, for example, what's the approval process. So, for example, medicinal cannabis can be registered on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods with the Therapeutic Goods Administration. But most commonly, what's happening with medicinal cannabis is that it's coming through in terms of supply, the approval and licensing through the Office of Drug Control. And so that is a different process than the Therapeutic Goods Administration in terms of licensing registration. if you register the product through the TGA on the ARTG, you have to comply with the TGA requirements in relation to licensing and registration. If you supply the product through the Office of Drug Control, that is an alternative to the licensing and registration. But you've got to remember that other parts of the therapeutic goods legislation still applies, and that includes, for example, the promotion of the product. Medicinal cannabis is quite often supplied in Australia through an exception through the registration process through the ARTG. And the most common to accept, well, there's 3 exceptions. One is the authorised prescriber scheme, the second is the special access scheme, and third is in relation to clinical trials. It is possible for medicinal cannabis to be provided to patients through the special access scheme by a medical practitioner providing the prescription, but there's still a notification process with the TGA in relation to that. Some of the things that we're really finding interesting in relation to medicinal cannabis is the concern over vertical integration. So that means, for example, providing medicinal cannabis through an online process where potential patients are attracted to an online portal. They're directed to a medical practitioner who will provide a telehealth consultation. Then they're directed to a pharmacy that will prescribe the medication. And obviously, one of the suppliers, so for example, the drug company that's supplying the medicinal cannabis is involved in that particular structure. And so there's concerns in relation to that, particularly in relation to the method of prescribing and whether an appropriate consultation is taking place before the medicinal cannabis is prescribed and dispensed, and also the issue of conflicts of interest that arise when there's a relationship, a commercial relationship between the supplier, the prescriber and the dispenser. So we're seeing a lot of work in relation to that. Another main issue that we're seeing in relation to the regulatory area for medicinal cannabis lately is the Therapeutic Goods Administration has been highly active in relation to prosecuting infringements of the Therapeutic Goods Act and regulations in relation to medicinal cannabis. So medicinal cannabis is a medicine, and quite often it's supplied as a Schedule 4, which is a prescription-only medicine, or Schedule 8, which is a controlled drug. And so both Schedule 4 and Schedule 8 requires a prescription to be able to dispense the medication. And as I said previously, the Therapeutic Goods Act applies in relation to the promotion, and that includes the Therapeutic Goods Advertising Code. And under the Therapeutic Goods Advertising Code, Therapeutic Goods Act, it is prohibited to promote medicines, prescription medicines, to the public. And so what we've been seeing is the Therapeutic Goods Administration has been very active in prosecuting companies for promoting medicinal cannabis products to the public.
And picking up on where you left off there, Alison, in terms of the issues around prescribing and dispensing, Mitch, I wanted to get your thoughts on what you're seeing in the practitioner space with, in the last 12 months, with issues around potentially prescribing and dispensing medicinal cannabis.
Yeah, thanks, Bridget. It's certainly been an uptick in the issues facing medical practitioners and also pharmacy practitioners in both prescribing and dispensing. With that vertical integration that Alison spoke about, that really calls into issue some of the professional responsibilities of those clinicians in terms of discharging their obligation responsibilities to ensure that the product that is being prescribed and dispensed is appropriate, it's safe, and there's a therapeutic need for that product. So we're seeing a lot of activity in the space from the regulator in terms of medical practitioners and pharmacy practitioners in ensuring that those standards are being met in terms of their adherence to their codes of practice and best practice. Ensure it's a little about safety as well. We're talking about unapproved medicines in the medicinal cannabis space. They're S8s, so they're very they've got the potential to be very significant adverse effects for patients, and they're really ensuring for practitioners that they're in the patient's best interest, and they're, as a practitioner, discharging their obligations. So we are seeing from the regulator, being AHPRA and the national boards, we are seeing an effort really to ensure that ensuring best practice for practitioners. So there has been a number of investigations over the last 12 months concerning both medical practitioners and pharmacy practitioners, and we're working quite closely with them across a number of states. There hasn't yet been any, as far as I'm aware, any prosecutions in any of the tribunals as yet, but that certainly may come. And it depends a lot on the nature of the prescribing, and that's where practitioners can really find themselves in a bit of bother when they're engaging with third parties and have relationships with them, commercial relationships with them, which might jeopardize or call into question some of their obligations. They might be pressured in some way to do some form of prescribing or some act in dispensing as a pharmacist. So it's really ensuring as a practitioner that you're free from any of that, and yet you're discharging your obligations as required by your national board.
Alongside the rise in medicinal cannabis, which seems to be growing over the last couple of years, there's also been the rise in the use of telehealth consultations coming out of COVID, and that's been, a really positive thing for a lot of people. But how has this role and how has this platform played in the prescribing of medicinal cannabis? Either Alison or Mitch, happy for your thoughts on, on how you see that role.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of it stems from obviously during COVID, the telehealth platform was a very useful tool in terms of allowing access for patients to practitioners, to medical practitioners and other practitioners. So it served that purpose well. I think what we're seeing more recently, though, is that the telehealth platform is being used for medicinal cannabis, I guess, prescribing, or opportunity for prescribers to meet with patients to then allow for prescribing of medicinal cannabis through the telehealth platform. And the telehealth platform, look, there have been guidelines published by the medical board on what telehealth ought to be used for, and it's certainly not it doesn't replace in-person consultations. It's not intended to do that. So it's really a complementary system to assist in engagement with a practitioner by a patient. So I think that really, from a practitioner's point of view, there needs to be a lot of care taken to ensure that you've got an appropriate history from the patient, and you understand the clinical picture, or the representation from the patient about why, what their symptoms are, what the condition is that they're attending to you with, and that you're discharging your obligations, and your responsibility is ensuring that it's whatever you're going to be dispensing is safe for the patient, and there's a therapeutic need for that patient to be prescribed that medication. That's all medication. So I think there's a really the telehealth platform has a challenge in that it can present a practitioner with a real difficulty in understanding a true picture of the patient who's representing to you. And I think practitioners need to be careful of that. And that also applies, I think, in the pharmacy practitioner space as well, where you might have a situation where a patient obtains a script through a telehealth consultation. That script is then posted or provided to a pharmacy, and the pharmacy then receives that script, processes it, dispenses it, and may mail it out, and has no contact with the patient at all. And that's really a really big risk factor and red flag. And there needs to be an independent exercise of clinical judgment by the pharmacist to ensure, again, that the product being supplied or the medication being supplied to the patient is safe. And I have some strong views that cannot be achieved by a phone call. It really needs to be a better understanding, just a phone call to get a full picture of that patient's profile, to ensure that before it's then dispensed, that product is going to be safe. So I think from a pharmacy point of view, there's a lot of challenges presented through the telehealth pathway, which then results in a script being provided and zero contact with a patient. It's fraught with danger, that process for practitioners. So I really stress that a practitioner ought to be very aware of their obligations in ensuring that they're scrutinising a script as a pharmacist, but also as a medical practitioner, that telehealth platform is being used in a way that you are comfortable as a practitioner, that you're adhering to your professional obligations.
From my point of view, there's two issues in relation to telehealth and medicinal cannabis. One is that the MBS item number for telemedicine usually requires that there is a 12-month existing and continuous relationship between the medical practitioner and the patient before there's reimbursement for that consultation. So if you are a patient and you want to have a telehealth consultation and be reimbursed by Medicare, then you should have a 12-month continuing relationship. Obviously, if that isn't the case, then that consultation will have to be either be paid by the patient or be paid by the company that's supplying the drug. So there's a financial consent issue in relation to that. Secondly, as Mitchell said, with telehealth or telemedicine, it's absolutely fantastic. Since COVID-19, it's really opened the doors for people to be provided medical advice using technology. But the issue is that it needs to be provided, the advice needs to be provided appropriately in accordance with peer professional practice in Australia and in accordance with the college guidelines. And so having a checklist, for example, when patients either call or access a company through the internet, just having a checklist of questions and answers is problematic, because under the law, practitioners are required to advise clients of the material risk of the treatment, and that material risk depends upon what the actual patient considers as material. So having a checklist is not going to necessarily facilitate complying with that legal requirement. One thing with medicinal cannabis is that it has quite a relatively high rate of addiction. And so I don't think people are really aware of that. And so as part of the arrangements for having a telemedicine consultation with the patient, one would think that you would normally advise them of the rate of addiction, but then if that telemedicine consult is being controlled by a company that supplies the medicinal cannabis, that obviously creates natural conflict of interest. So that's one area of concern that the regulators have at the moment.
I think also on that, the ability of the telehealth practitioner to have access to clinical records for a patient to understand their background is imperative. I would say that you would, as a practitioner, need to be aware of, and as Alison was touching upon, what is the clinical background of a patient? Have they got any pre-existing issues or any mental health matters that need to be addressed in terms of assessing risk? So I think that's really important from a risk mitigation point of view as a medical practitioner.
Potentially that picks up on, Alison, what you were saying about the benefits of the being able to financially claim something back, the 12 months period. If a practitioner has that 12-month relationship with a patient, they can pick up on their history, risks of addiction, for example.
Absolutely. So, I mean, there's a lot of benefits with telehealth. The issue is, obviously being aware of the conflicts of interest with the vertical integration and making sure that, I'm not saying that it can't be done, but it certainly can be done, but it's got to be done appropriately.
Yeah. Mitch, in terms of AHPRA and the various boards and the role that they play in in medicinal cannabis and regulating medicinal cannabis in that space, what type of actions have you been seeing from AHPRA and the boards?
We've seen AHPRA quite engaged in the space, as I alluded to before, with the medicinal cannabis regulation of health practitioners. Actually, we had a webinar a few weeks ago, and we were fortunate to have Jason McKaiser, the National Director of the Rapid Regulatory Response Unit, speak at the webinar for those who are interested. And he provided some very useful information in terms of some of the matters that AHPRA are focusing on in the space, and in particular, that some of the concerns that they were looking into were inadequate patient assessment prior to prescribing, inadequate consideration of contraindications, prescribing as access versus treatment, lack of treatment plans, referrals of coordinated care, age and identity checking, and that feeds into the telehealth issue we were just discussing before, real-time prescription monitoring, so the use of SafeScript, financial incentives or inducement, which Alison's touched upon in terms of vertical integration, excessive prescribing and unsupervised delivery, so mailing out, as I alluded to before, mailing out of medicinal cannabis. So there are a number of issues that the national regulator is looking into, and that's in conjunction with the national boards. So in this case, predominantly the medical board and also the pharmacy board, matters that they're looking at in terms of the practitioner and their individual responsibilities there as well. So yeah, look, in short, there's a lot going on in terms of the regulation in the space of practitioners, and I think it's just going to continue, particularly where we've got a real uptake in awareness now, I think, in the general public of medicinal cannabis, and also where the evidence is leading to as what types of conditions of cannabis could be useful to treat. And I think as that develops in kind of mainstream society, I think there's going to be more access to those inquiring about the use and the clinical benefit, therapeutic benefit that can be derived from medicinal cannabis. So I think that's going to be something the regulator is going to be on top of for quite some time.
I agree completely. And one thing that I think the government's going to be looking at is the doctor shopping for medicinal cannabis. As patients are dependent on it, they're going to be concerned about, getting it from multiple suppliers. So I think, how you've got to go to show your driver's license when you get cold and flu tablets. I think that the government, I mean, that's not prescription, but I think what we'll see is the government starting to look at the prescribing trends and whether it's been
the use of SafeScript, yeah, definitely. I think the use of SafeScript, it's mandatory in some states and certainly recommended in others, and probably tending towards being mandatory in all states. But it's an invaluable tool in terms of recording of medication for patients, so that to avoid doctor shopping, and also for patient safety, just to ensure that the volume, talking about dosage and volume, so that they are acceptable levels, and it's really a good tool to monitor that. So certainly as prescribers and as pharmacists dispensing, it is imperative that SafeScript for all SHs is utilised, because it's a tool that's at your disposal and ought to be used.
For practitioners looking to expand their practice to include prescribing or dispensing of medicinal cannabis, what should they be aware of or mindful of?
I think for the standard of care for medical practitioners in Australia as professionals, it's set out in the civil liability legislation, which is pretty consistent throughout the country. They have to prescribe in accordance with peer professional practice in Australia. And so that's really being aware of what the College of GPs or other relevant colleges' guidelines are. And if they are concerned that the dosage is too high, what we would recommend and what our clients are recommending is getting a second medical opinion. Mitch, do you want to add to that?
Yes, exactly right. I think that there's my advice to all practitioners is don't go into an area unless you are familiar with and well established to understand and have a background to be comfortable in either prescribing or dispensing in the space. You can't be half in. You need to be educated firstly to understand what's involved, what the requirements are, what the legal requirements are, but also what your professional requirements are from your board. So that's really important to set that framework and have a well-established setup. This shouldn't just be something that is an additional part of your practice. You should invest in the preparation so that your practices are appropriate and legal from the start. So I think it's that investment piece is a big part of it, and that's the education through the colleges and through professional education bodies for each of the for each of the professions are very important to draw upon to upskill, if you're looking to upskill in these areas to either be prescribing or dispensing medicinal cannabis. And I think I said, there are, through the TGA, as Alison alluded to earlier, there are requirements in terms of approvals. So ensuring that you're familiar with and have all the required, and I think getting advice, obtaining legal advice and navigating your way through it so you don't find yourself with a letter from the regulator after the fact, I think it's really important to establish your practice correctly from the start, get the advice so that it's well structured, well set up, and it's going to run better as well. I mean, it's going to be a more efficient practice if you've got the structures in place. So I think that's really the big piece of guidance I would be providing to practitioners who I tend to find myself assisting practitioners who do find themselves unfortunately in a situation where they have received a notification from the regulator with a non-compliance issue or an issue to explain as to why action ought not be taken. So it's really working after the fact with those practitioners. So just bearing that observation in mind, I'd be saying to practitioners, don't find yourself in that position. Be ahead of the game, educate yourself, and establish your practice properly from the start is imperative.
I think both of those tips and both of the guidance that each of you have identified will be really helpful for practitioners. Thanks everyone for listening today. I think that wraps it up. We've had a really good discussion from both Alison and Mitch around medicinal cannabis and the regulatory space and what's happening in that space in Australia. In next week's episode, we're going to be discussing the recent amendments to legislation surrounding vapes in Australia. So we hope you can join us for that discussion. As always, please get in touch with us if you have any questions. You can find our details on our website, which is hallandwilcox.com.au, or connect with us on LinkedIn. If you enjoyed today's episode, then rate, review, or subscribe to our podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Thank you.
This podcast is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as such. You should always obtain legal advice about your specific circumstances.